Hello and welcome to another episode of Statford Bridge, Chelsea by the Numbers. We've got our first ever guest today. Welcome, John Mackenzie from The Athletic. I would say the world's preeminent social media out of possession expert. John, welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed following Chelsea through your YouTube channel, so it's a pleasure to be on it finally.
Thank you. Yeah, I think what I really wanted to do is Chelsea have a very, very short preseason, and everybody's already talking about all the fun in possession stuff and all the 8 million new signings. But maybe the most interesting thing about this team is they improved by almost 20 goals defensively last year. And if they want to be a legitimate title challenger, they probably have to improve another 10 to 15 goals to really, really be at that level. And I think you're the perfect person to talk to for this. So we can get into some data. We've got the tactics board out. We'll go through and we'll talk about last year. We'll talk about the Club World Cup and we can see. I think the most interesting place to start is going to be the data, which is always where we start here. I think one of the things I really like about your coverage is you blend the data and the tactics quite well together, which is really fun because this was not a thing 10 years ago at all. What has stood out to you so far in the numbers that you've seen? And we've got some stuff on the screen there thinking about this team last year.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would be interested to hear your thoughts on this because in my head, what happens with Chelsea last season is they go from being, I mean, the sort of standard narrative, which is probably just too neat that that Maresca uses, roughly speaking, like a Pochettino-ish approach at the beginning of the season. And eventually then we see midway through the season an attempt to maybe solid things up a bit more defensively, try to be less transitional. And I think that the general consensus was that decision, according to the underlying numbers, was a good decision because we saw an uptick in the numbers. So I'm kind of interested to hear what your take is on like that rough narrative and how you kind of break down what happened through the season.
I think that's vaguely true. I think it's much more true defensively than it is in possession, which I think is a thing people said a lot during the season. But defensively, it's definitely true. Where the first half of the season, the press was much more aggressive. And the second half of the season, they were much more willing to defend in a mid-block, cede some possession, and be a little bit more stable, where down the stretch, I think Chelsea conceded like 3 goals in the last 11 games or something quite good like that. I think one of the things that's perhaps most interesting is Opta Analysts came out with a big set of stats for all of last season, and they looked at the different defensive line heights and kind of how compact different teams were, and there were a couple really interesting stats in there. First, Chelsea were the lowest teams in terms of the frequency of low block defending. They were very, very heavy in terms of mid-block. They pressed a reasonable amount, but weren't great. They were like kind of 5th, 6th in terms of pressing metrics. I think Mark Arstad's had them at the 6th highest defensive line height, stuff like that. But they never defended deep. Never defended really, really deep. And the other one that really stood out to me that I think we can get to the tactics board from this is Opta have a metric that they called like compactness that was basically looking at the area covered by if you drew the perimeter of all of the players. And if you set some number, I think they used 900 square meters as you're no longer compact. Chelsea spent the most amount of time in that full stretch defensive shape. So if we go to the tactics board, I think that might be the place to go. Chelsea started, like you said, 4-4-2, 4-2-3-1, however you want it. But you would very often see them fully spread out and like just huge spaces to manage things man to man. Is that what you saw last year?
Yeah, I think I found this super interesting actually about Chelsea. Just like I say, roughly a 4-2-3-1-ish kind of shape, maybe a 4-4-1-1, depending on how you look at it, and lots of different iterations on this. But one of the very common ones that we saw was usually the 10 being quite a cheaty player. So often the 10 jumping up, and in those situations, it was usually the case that the the opposite side centre midfielder would also jump up. So Fernandez often, Caicedo when Lavia was playing him was on the other side. Um, again, there were certain situations where you'd see both of these players jumping up a lot. The centre midfielders, I think, were given a huge amount of responsibility in some of these more aggressive jump phases, and it felt to me that it was very hard for Chelsea to actually the players to actually monitor the players that they were supposed to be doing within the spaces they were supposed to be doing it in. And it put the players, I think, often in quite a bit of quite a lot of pressure. I would say earlier on in the season, it felt to me as though Maresca was much less willing to allow these 1v1 matchups in the back line to occur. And that was something that maybe we saw happening a little bit more readily as the season went on, culminating in the Club World Cup final, where Chalobah in particular was, and both Chalobah and Colwell were actually willing to follow the PSG players out. But I would say that for me, in the high press phase, that Chelsea always seemed to have a weakness, and by which I mean they would select a player who was going to jump between two opponents who they were going to mark. So in this instance, we're talking like Palmer jumping from the centre mid to the centre back, or the other thing we saw a lot as the season wore on was either Neto or maybe Palmer or Neto on the other side jumping between the fullback and the centre back, with the idea that when this happens, you're just going to be happy for your fullback to jump up and cover the opposing fullback. And I mean, we're going to talk a little bit about what we saw in the Fluminense game. We saw it in a few different games actually in the Club World Cup, but it feels to me as though this is a really unworkable way of constructing a press in 2025, because you just leave often the fullback with a huge amount of work to do. So yeah, it actually would be maybe tempting to drop one of the opponent players out, because I think often what happened in the beginning of the season was it was a bit more like this, right, where you were covering with an extra player the opposition's centre forward, and that meant that the opponent could then force a free player somewhere, and if they did that and you went man to man, then they could quite often force these big spaces in between the lines as well. And then say in this situation, if Neto jumps, then the idea is that James comes across and then Chalobah covers for James. In this instance, this is obviously purely hypothetical, and I think that's, largely speaking, that's fine, but I just think that the distances can become too much. If the winger for the opponent here is savvy, he can drag the fullback away ahead of this jump by Neto, and then obviously that increases the spaces that are available. So I've been on. Sorry, this is a very long and roundabout way of answering the question, but I've spent a lot of time in the last season talking about how hybrid press is. So what I mean by a hybrid press is a press that you're trying to work from a zonal system base, but you're going to jump into man-to-man phases at certain times when the triggers are correct. They've become much less aggressive, I think, over the last few seasons, because there's a realization that those kind of presses are very reactive and they're manipulable. So opponents can move man-to-man oriented players around. You can increase the distances between marking responsibility. So yeah, with Neto between the centre back and the fullback, you can either increase the distance between those two players, or, as we talked about in that example there, you can increase the space between the fullback and the winger so that James has a massive jump to make. And I think once you start doing that, it can become kind of easy to move an opponent around who are using these hybrid presses to generate chances. And I think Arsenal are a good example of that at the end of the 23-24 season. A lot of teams, particularly in Europe, were finding ways of doing that. Thomas Tuchel, unsurprising to Chelsea fans, very smart out of possession dude. And he had some really nice solutions to some of the issues that exist in Arsenal's hybrid press. And so last season, I think we saw Arsenal being actually way less aggressive in their pressing than they have been in previous seasons. They put up the lowest number of high regains for about 4 or 5 seasons, pretty much the lowest that they'd done under Mikel Arteta, apart from maybe the first season. So we're starting to see those kind of approaches becoming less used. And so a lot of my reading of what Maresca is doing is that it almost feels like he's a couple of seasons out of date, almost on the high theory of out of possession. But I'm sure that he will start catching up because yeah, he's just a flexible guy who is seemingly like well up on the tactic side of things. So that's what I'm kind of interested in watching from Chelsea next season, because I think this is an area where Chelsea have a huge amount of upside still to find. But yeah, maybe we should talk about personnel, because I think it's very easy for me to criticize the theory behind what's going on. But I think the biggest issue that Chelsea have had since Maresca's been around is that he doesn't have necessarily the personnel to be able to pull this kind of approach off. And I mean, all tactical systems are only as good as the players that you have in them. By which I mean you can implement a tactic and it can go badly. That doesn't mean the tactics are necessarily bad as a structural theoretical idea. But if you've got players who can't actually enact those tactical ideas, then it becomes a problem. And I think even just seeing Joao Pedro coming in for the last couple of games of the Club World Cup made it very clear how even adding a couple of players who are maybe a little bit more optimized for out of possession can really improve your system.
No, I think you're spot on. And we've seen in terms of manipulating those hybrid presses, we've seen Chelsea do that to teams. Like
Yeah.
Chelsea played Liverpool at home towards the end of the season and are dragging Gravenberch and McAllister everywhere
Mhm.
for players to get between lines. We saw it against PSG. It's very, very, very difficult when you have those two aspects. And I think that was something that I did not like at the time. I remember us speaking in April talking about Maresca getting progressively more man to man as the season went on.
Mhm.
And yeah, the Neto kind of having to split the difference in who he's jumping to versus where he's tracking. This was a problem all season we saw with Chelsea, where it would be Neto would get baited into a jump. They might bounce around out to a fullback or whatever. And as James or Gusto is jumping, it's a pass into the channel. And now it's Chaloba and it's
Mhm.
Colwill. And it's these repeated high intensity sprints for center backs. And we saw Wesley Fofana went down. We saw Badiashile go down. Like this was a thing that they had to deal with. The point you make about personnel, I think, is particularly pertinent on a day when we get lots of briefs from your athletic colleague David Ornstein about Nico Jackson, who is a
Mhm.
fabulously intense defender, perhaps leaving the club. I think João Pedro is quite close to him as a defender, but I think when we talk about the wingers, Chelsea had a set of wingers last year that were not really an excellent bunch defensively. And I
Yeah.
think the call that Maresca made going to progressively more man-to-man ideas was very much to accommodate those players. In Jadon Sancho was a frequent starter last year. Jadon Sancho has been dogged by being a poor defender his whole career and had probably the best defensive season of his career with a very, very easy task of if the fullback goes, you're just going to follow him and nothing is going to change.
Yeah.
And I think when we talk about defensive ideas, is it optimal? Definitely not. But does it let you keep players that you think help you win on the pitch? Yes,
Yeah.
in that circumstance. And the reality is if we go back and take a look at the numbers, like Chelsea were massively improved defensively. And so a lot of that is on the other side of the ball, where if you look at things like field tilt, they had something like 10% more field tilt than they did the year before. When we built G Plus at ASA, if you think about where you're turning the ball over, if you turn the ball over on the edge of the opposition penalty area, you're about as likely to concede from that transition as you are to counter press back and win it and score on your counter press. If you
Mhm.
lose the ball at half, you're twice as likely to concede as you are to win it back and score. So just reducing those, you can think about that. That might be a quarter of a goal a game, and that's 9 goals a season or whatever it is. So it is, these things are very, very linked both sides, but I think there's clear room for improvement. And I think we've started to see Maresca trying to do a couple different things. And I think this might be
Mhm.
where we can talk about the cool stuff going on at the Club World Cup. There was a lot of talk from the Fluminense game in the semifinal, where Chelsea pressed very, very hybrid everywhere. Almost every player had dual roles. I would quibble that some of these are not actually dual roles, where like Cucurella is not realistically making this jump to the player
Mhm.
here. Um, and Caicedo is very free. So like this player, does Gusto ever really have to actually jump to them? I don't know.
Mhm.
Talk to me about this if we can go back to the board. What do you see here? What worries you? What excites you from something like this back three?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the big question here is like, how are you going to mitigate the fact that you've got two very aggressively placed wingers in between outside centre backs and wing backs, right? And yeah, I think that was it this game where I've not actually got this noted down for this game. I've got it in the Benfica game that it felt in that game you played a bit more of a 4-1-4-1 shape,
Correct.
and you were using Palmer in the on the left hand side with Cucurella doing big jumps up from there as well. And Benfica, on a number of occasions, were able to just utilize that as a pretty consistent way of generating ball progression. So I'll go on the board to just talk about what I mean. But again, it's the same idea of causing a tension between this player who is between the outside centre back and the wing back in this instance, and then if you're left in a sort of overload scenario with the opposition pushing their players forward, it does mean that Cucurella has to jump and someone has to come across. And as soon as you're doing these actions, you can end up losing your marks and actually ball progression being relatively easy. So even in the picture that you've got on that slide with the Fluminense game, yeah, obviously in this situation, if Neto jumps onto the outside centre back, someone has to cover the outside player here. In the Benfica game, Caicedo was actually doing a lot more of that, I think, as the game went on, because it became clear that it wasn't working to have Cucurella make the jump. But I think even interestingly on this slide in the Fluminense game, we can see that it's very much the case that that Cucurella is orienting himself to the forward rather than the wide player. And there's things that you could do. I mean, it's a hybrid role, right? So you could definitely position him more aggressively there. You can see the two centre backs want to sit in an overload clearly. On the striker, which is, I think, definitely a Maresca thing to do. And there's been some horror stories maybe last season where you guys went more man to man and it went badly, like the City game,
Yeah,
the
city
second City
away,
game.
city away. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean that was madness, that game, because essentially what ended up happening is that you went man to man. City were able to bait the press forward. Haaland was isolated against Chalobah, and the rest of Haaland's teammates were able to just generate space around him. And then you've just got Edison on the ball, just pinging the ball into the channel. Both of the goals came from one ball was to Haaland, where Rob Sanchez made some questionable decisions in goal, but the other
correct.
one was a ball straight through to De Bruyne, who was able to play Haaland through from there as well. And I think clearly Maresca was probably burned by that happening on a couple of occasions, and so in this instance, he does want to have that extra coverage. But again, in a game against a team like Fluminense here, I would have been probably experimenting to be like, let's try with Cucurella in a bit more of an aggressive position and see how it breaks down. Is it better for you to allow easy progression through the first few phases by allowing routes through the first few lines of the press? And I think we had this conversation after the Chelsea Spurs game where Neto was doing that cheat
Yeah,
between the fullback and the centre back, and it felt like if Spurs had been a bit more on it, and if you come up against good teams where the players are at a level where they can almost on the fly do those kind of automatisms where they're like, okay, this is where the weakness is. Here's the free player. There's a great quote by Pep Guardiola from about I don't know, it's early 20s, where he's on Spanish TV, and he talks about how his approach to positional play is always just, I give the team an understanding of where the weaknesses are going to be in the opposition structure, and then it's up to them to find the ways around it. So he'll say if the winger jumps up onto the centre back, the free player is the fullback. So you have to find that player. And he's like, how do the team find that player? I don't know. That's up to them. It's their job to do that. And I think that's that's what you really expect from those high level players, to be able to actually work a press around like that and then play through it. I think that's probably more, I don't know. And again, like, clearly Maresca doesn't agree with this, because he's obviously gone for like man-to-man high presses where the ball has been played over the top and it hasn't gone well. But I think if you marry that with a sort of more hybrid option here, with Cucurella maybe in a slightly more aggressive position to give him a better chance of arriving at the wing back, and then equally the chance of getting back to help out defensively should the ball be played long. I think that would probably be a bit more upside there for Chelsea as well. I can't remember what the original question was, but I've waffled a little while. But I think that's what I want to see more from Chelsea out of possession, is a sense that just instinctiveness, right? We've just talked about it in terms of instinctiveness on the ball. So being aware of where the weaknesses are, where the spaces are, how to generate separation from players. Because in the modern game, things are going increasingly man to man. So it's not about finding spaces so much as creating separation and then being able to access the player who's generated time and space for themselves. The same thing is true out of possession. I think that we need, the better teams always have a level of instinctiveness in their play where they're not necessarily just reacting to triggers, because whenever you're reacting to triggers, you're always going to be reacting. So you're always going to be slightly slower than the opponent. And the best out of possession teams are always the ones where they get to a level where they're anticipating what's going to happen beforehand and already making the jump before the trigger has happened almost. So I think that's the level that I want to see from Chelsea, maybe increasingly coming into this season. But I think there's plenty of players in the Chelsea squad who I think they can maximize. I think Caicedo is just, I think he's a fantastic player. And I was always roughly a fan of him, but I think this season in particular, with and without the ball, he's just such an asset. And I think he's the kind of player that you can kind of build around in an out possession sense. If you have someone who is smart like that, who you can sit in the middle and give quite a free role. In many respects, that's kind of what Arsenal have done with Declan Rice. I think if you can do that with Caicedo, then the question is, like, how do you mitigate the maybe slightly weaker players? As you said, Sancho, you give him a very sort of simple man-to-man oriented role and responsibility. Whereas with someone like Neto, perhaps you can start to introduce a little bit more creativity to it. But I think as things stand, like it does become there's almost like a kind of woodenness to the way that Chelsea do things. Like they're clearly well coached in that respect. But I think that with some of the players, it's just I think you have to sort of make do with what they are going to do out of possession, and you have to then try and work around it, as you said. So like Cole Palmer, even just Cole Palmer moving back into the second line of the press against PSG in the Club World Cup final, I think that just made a big difference. Although again, I think in that game, it's just you go man to man against PSG. That's just the best way of playing against them as a general rule. And I think that kind of made it suitable for a suitable matchup for Chelsea out of possession.
Yeah, I think I really want to touch on a few things you said at the beginning, particularly about Caicedo's role and who is filling in the channels. Like, this was a thing you would see a lot last year where Cucurella does end up jumping and Colwill maybe gets dragged, and maybe the opposition split their front three in some way, where you have Caicedo as now like functionally a center back tracking into channels. And I think the thing with Chelsea last year was that if Caicedo ends up in this role, functionally tracking someone into a channel, they do not have a player who can do the things he can do in here, in terms of not just my role is to jump to this player, but Caicedo was really the only player who had the wherewithal or the freedom to, like, okay, no, I'm not tracking now, I'm jumping here. There's something about this moment where we have this chance. And he's the guy who really sees that. And I think when we talk about personnel for next season, Chelsea did not have a midfielder last year who could do the things he did. Romeo Lavia is like, I don't like Lavia as much as many other people. I don't know if you have opinions on Lavia, but Lavia has like his only decision is jump. Like he has no ability to screen. He is only jumping. And
Yeah.
Enzo Fernandez is also mostly only jumping. I think for next season, the player who really excites me in terms of, oh, there might be something really here defensively is Andre Santos,
Yep.
who he in the Club World Cup final had a fabulous game when he came on, and very, very, very reasonable deputy for Caicedo when Caicedo was suspended in the Club World Cup. And he was able to do a lot of those things. And he has that same ability to burst. He also has that weird thing where like he can be totally the wrong side and he will somehow win the ball perfectly cleanly, the same way Caicedo does. I think when you think about a lot of the games, Chelsea are going to get away with defending the exact same way as they did last year. But when they play the Cities and the Liverpools and the Arsenals and the top teams in the table, I would not be shocked if we saw Maresca go with something we would call more conservative, but to get Andre Santos in there next to Caicedo. And now you have two players who can make the really difficult decisions for you and execute the pretty big physical asks of them.
Yeah. I mean, it's worth talking about the Club World Cup final against PSG, right? Because I think that's a great example of a game where I don't know, the game sort of, I still feel as though Chelsea are very much a team who are suited if they can play underdog football against these big sides. So there was a few games, even just watching through the run up to the final, where Chelsea looked quite fragile in certain ways, I thought. And even like the first game was like LAFC, and the LAFC were like playing their press around and like creating three players on the far side, and it was kind of like, oh, this is crazy. But then you get to the final, and it was like, oh, this is just completely different kettle of fish, because Chelsea are able to play really direct. They're able to, and I thought out of possession, just the plan was really nice. The idea of dropping off in certain phases, but then jumping into your man to man. It was very hybrid in many respects. Certain triggers when Vitinha dropped into the first line of build up, then that was definitely a trigger. When the ball was then played to the centre back for Chelsea to jump, there was like nice triggers, and you would end up very quickly in situations where they were under pressure. And also the fact that you can play someone like Pedro Neto as basically a wing back out of possession in those mid block phases.
His tracking of Hakimi all game was like,
yeah,
you are a second left back with Cucurella.
And do you know what? I would not be surprised if the internal communications about or discussions about letting Madueke go were based around out of possession concerns. The fact that you can play Neto on the right hand side and use him as essentially, well, you can play him on both sides, but you can use him on the right and you can use him very much as that player who drops off. Again, maybe it was the Chelsea game. Was it the Chelsea game where Madueke basically had to play as a wing back last season? Well, there's one game last season where Madueke was effectively playing as the outside player in a back five, and
he had a few, yeah.
Yeah, and it just didn't work at all. And yeah, I'm a massive fan of Madueke. I think he's great, and I think Chelsea probably should have kept him. But I wouldn't be surprised if the conversation about what happened came down to that they just felt he didn't have the out possession flexibility to be as much of an upside as maybe someone like Neto, who probably has a in possession downside on Madueke, but has the capacity to you sort of play him in lots of situations. Because after all, right, Maresca is just a flexible coach, right? He's constantly rotating players. He may have the structure which roughly is the same, and it moves between iterations of out of possession approaches. But he does constantly change the players in each of the positions, and is obviously moving towards a much more rotational system anyway. So it wouldn't surprise me if that came up. Sorry, I went on a wild digression when we were talking about...
The Madueke point is really good, because one of my big gripes from last season was, even with the like strong side, ball side, fullback playthroughs, or however you want to describe them, one of the real things was... that really frustrated me, and particularly with Madueke, who, again, is a player I love. People on this podcast know I was very opposed to that sale. I really like Madueke. One of the things I hated was that if he was in some role that has to jump, if they were beat down the other side, there was no recovery from the weak side winger ever. So it's
Mm.
just, even if you decide and whatever, everybody comes over and everybody tracks, it was very easy for teams to get to this player in the pocket and then continue the attack, even though really if you get beat out wide, you should be able to lock them to this side of the pitch and reduce the danger. But it was very, very poor. Whereas Neto was significantly better at coming back, gaining density, and being that
Hmm.
player. So I think that I would be shocked if it didn't play a role in
Yeah.
those conversations. I think one of the things we saw for the final, like you said, is when that weak side player's role, it was the wingers were opposite, so it doesn't really matter for the final. But it is now, you're not jumping, you are following to make the
Yeah.
five to track Hakimi every time, or you are tracking Nuno Mendes the whole time. I think those roles become simplified. What I would be curious about, and a thing that Chelsea did not handle amazingly last year, is with more and more fullbacks going inside, those responsibilities become a lot murkier.
Yeah.
And so when we think about someone like Arsenal with Lewis Skelly, who
Hmm.
has the flexibility to be the width holder, but also comes inside, but also will drop deep, and he's a fabulous player to watch.
Yeah. Yeah.
That role is so hard if you're going to be very, very man oriented. And I think this is like the crux of Maresca's season. I think the attacking stuff will come. You have so much talent. Like
Yeah.
the ideas, I think, were probably a bit like, okay, 2-3-5, and you guys figure it out, and that stuff will come with time. Um, it's hard when you're playing twice a week and you're flying to Astana midweek to implement these attacking ideas.
Hmm.
I am mostly curious to see, okay, how do you handle inverting fullbacks? How do you handle when there are players who have multiple roles in a build and then very different shapes in the final third as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And in many respects, that's, Chelsea have tried to utilize that kind of rotational flexibility to generate advantages themselves too, right? So it's sort of, you live by the sword, die by the sword on these sorts of things. But yeah, I thought it was interesting as well. Maybe, I don't know, maybe we should talk about the players that you've brought in. I don't know if that's interesting to you, but I often think that when you see the sort of signings that are made, it can tell you a lot about what teams sort of recognize as being weaknesses in their approach as things stand. So I thought, like, for example, bringing in Joral Hatto, for example, for as a backup to Cucurella or a rotation option with Cucurella, very interesting. Given Cucurella, I have a real funny soft spot for, because I think he just, he has big sideshow Bob energy, David Luiz energy,
Yeah.
and in many respects is a sort of very flawed footballer, or at least the flaws that he has are sort of worn on his sleeve. And I think one of the best things about the second half of last season was just how Cucurella was made so functional in that Chelsea team. He scored a ton of goals coming in, like at the back post from fullback, and
A flying
has
header against Brentford, the
yeah.
5'7" fullback flying
Yeah,
header.
yeah, but and in many respects, he sort of is the Lewis Skelly of this Chelsea team, albeit, as I said, like a highly flawed player in many respects. But his ability to either play inverting into the middle, play in the pockets, play as a width provider, almost play as an attacking option as well in certain phases of play, as we said as well, makes him super valuable, I think, for Maresca. But the fact that they brought in Hatto as a backup is kind of interesting, because I think Hatto is good at the things that Cucurella isn't from an out of possession point of view. And so I think, again, it's all about flexibility, right? It's all about giving Maresca the options to be able to solve problems through substitutions if he feels as though he's not getting that from the starting 11. So yeah, I don't know if you thought that in general, because I've not really given any thought to the players that you brought in from an out of possession point of view, but have you had any thoughts on what those market moves make in terms of the out of possession side?
I think the Hato one is much. There's some out of possession stuff, but I think that one actually skews an in possession consideration, where Chelsea last season, when they built in the three, if Cucurella was
Yeah.
starting, which he started basically every game, he was often obviously gallivanting around doing whatever he was doing, which meant Levi Colwill was often the left of the three in the build. And
Yeah.
I think one of the considerations we've seen a lot is that Maresca wants to get to Colwill as the middle of the
Yeah.
three,
Yeah.
and he is the guy controlling all the tempo. And
Mhm.
Cucurella can do the back the left center back in a 3 thing, but he's not like his benefit in possession is like that he exists as a body you have to mark more so than he is a fabulous passer. And I think that's more where Hato comes in. The one for
Yep.
me in terms of inbounds defensively that I think has a stupidly high ceiling is Gittins, because he is very, very diligent in terms of tracking people. His recognition of jumps is pretty good, but he's young and his angles are kind of whatever. It's kind of that Bundesliga thing where like I'm
Yeah.
pressing, I'm maybe not that good at it, but because we're all pressing, it works.
Yep.
But he's a stupidly talented athlete, and when I look at him, I think a lot about the early Klopp era Liverpool teams where you just put a bunch of guys who are really fast and really strong and they want to go chase and they want to go win it.
Yeah.
That like it makes it so much easier to construct things for you. And
Mhm.
you put him and you put João Pedro and now instead of having like one real presser in the front 3 with Jackson, now you've got like 2.5 or 3
Yeah.
with Neto there as well. The one who very concerns me is Xavi Simons. He had a very high number of high regains in the data, but you watch the video and I'm like, I don't think this guy can
Yeah.
press. I think he's just flying into slide tackles and is getting lucky. But Gittins is the one who really excites me defensively in the press.
Yeah. Yeah, nice. And I think the thing with if you have a good presser on this side of the pitch in Gittins, you could start doing the Enzo Fernandez as a 10 almost, and then jumping through onto the side, which I think is I quite like Fernandez in the front line more so than Palmer. But yeah, again, it's a lot of this is just sort of flexibility. So I guess in that situation, you can have Palmer, Neto on either side, Fernandez here, and then jumping out into the front line with the ability then for Gittins to be covering for him a little bit as well. And one of the other things we saw in the Club World Cup actually is when the press is forced on one side, you've got your Fernandez or Caicedo jumping to cover the 10 when they jump onto the front line. It's the far side wide player coming inside as well, which is why LAFC were able to actually mitigate the press by them playing into space on the far side. But again, I think that comes down to personnel, right? In these sorts of situations, the idea is we're going to squeeze the wide forward inside to cover the space that opens out, because I think you got caught out a few times like that last season as well. But the idea then is that because you're going so aggressive in the wide area, you should be winning the ball, or at least making it impossible for them to find the switch to the far side. If they can do that, obviously it makes things a little bit more problematic. But I think, again, having two wingers who are able to, one, read the situation well, but two, have the mobility and athleticism to actually enact the jumps that they have to do in the correct way, that's just going to make Chelsea look much more dangerous from an out of possession point of view as well.
The Enzo Palmer role choice I think is really, really pertinent, because I agree with you. Enzo has played deeper most of his career, but he's kind of rubbish at screening things. He's very, very good at defending forward in front of him, jumping to things, and he's got like the amount of yards he got through in the final was ridiculous. And Palmer is very sneakily clever as a weak side, like, oh, there might be a bad pass to a center back here, I can jump, but also, if I like lean a couple of yards, I might be able to close this lane and just like poke something if it comes through. Where he has this reputation of being a bad defender, and I say it all the time. Apparently, he has like the highest fitness scores in the squad of everybody. He gets through the most yards, and he just sneakily, like, he'll pick up an interception here or there, and it really, really works. I think the last out of possession thing that I want to talk about before we get out of here, Chelsea last year had this insane offside trap on the edge of their own penalty area that is a remnant of Enzo Maresca's time working with Manuel Pellegrini. And it's very odd because I watch it and I hate it. And I'm like, I don't think this worked. And then you go back to the data and you look at it, and they had the third most offsides against in the league. Their shot quality against is quite low. Their shot volume against is quite low. Like, it's hard to argue that it wasn't working. But I think there's like a psychological thing particularly for fans, where you concede a goal, but it's offside. But in the fans' head and in their like creation of the atmosphere, they're like, oh, we just conceded a huge chance, even though as far as the event data is concerned, that never happened.
Yeah.
What do you think about this Manuel Pellegrini offside trap?
Do you know, it's really funny that you bring this up because I've been toying with the idea of talking a bit more about Galactico defending, um, which is, I have the same sort of experience of watching some of the big teams defend in ways that just aren't very good in certain situations, or at least look to all intents and purposes to be not very good, and yet their defensive numbers are like, yeah, this is probably fine. So yeah, I've called it Galactico defending because it's the Carlo Ancelotti Real Madrid, great example of that. Like nothing special out of possession, but always did enough to provide the platform for their strikers, for their forwards to outscore the opponent. And I think that it's kind of interesting because you could argue that Liverpool did this last season as well. There's like big problems with Liverpool's high press. I think they got played through quite regularly, and this is something that Slot would say. He would say, "Yeah, we probably get played through a bit too much, but then we're able to mop things up at the back." And I'm never really sure like how to rationalize this, because I always kind of just think, well, why don't you just improve your high press so that you don't have to run the risk of your players having to have incredible, because essentially Galactico defending then is you have really good duel winners. So I'm thinking, players like Antonio Rudiger, like Chelsea
Yeah.
fans will know him really well. He's like a classic example of this, right? Whatever happens, he's got the physicality, the athleticism, and the smarts to be able to defend in transitions really, really well. So it doesn't matter that you're conceding transitions because you've got really good transition defenders. And I think that was what weirdly that Real Madrid did quite well in the Ancelotti era, was they had those players who are really good at defending transitions. You don't have necessarily the defensive structure around you to help you defend those moments, but you have the individuals who can do that. So, and it's still true with Real Madrid. Like you've got Tchouaméni, you've got Camavinga, you've got even Jude Bellingham, players like that, really, really good individual duelers, and will track back and win things. And I think I was thinking about this a little bit with Chelsea because, and I've gone on a massive tangent again, so I apologize for this, but I had the same sort of experience, emotions watching the second half of the season Chelsea last year, where you look at the high press and you're like, there's lots of weaknesses here, but they seem to be getting away with it quite a lot. And I wonder what you think of my Galacticos defending theory and how it applies to Chelsea in the second half of last season.
I think it's explicitly a correct thing. Like I have described it as a lot of the best teams of the last, I don't know, 5 to 7 years or whatever have explicitly made the choice of, we have the best center backs in the world. We are going to ask them to make plays. Like we are going
Yeah,
to put Van Dijk and Konate on an island sometimes, and
yeah,
they're going to have to do that. And the trade offs of how aggressive we can be in the press ahead of that are worthwhile. I
yeah.
think the thing with Chelsea is they put their center backs on an island to make plays and did not get the trade offs appropriately ahead of that. Like you look at Fofana, like Fofana is the most insane center back I've ever watched, in that like the amount of recovery defending he can do is ridiculous. And he will chase guys to their own 6 yard box, and he can do that. But like you're not generating the high turnovers that the trade off on the other end of that is worth it. And I think that Galactico defending is a very funny way to describe it, but it is very accurate. And I think there was an interesting piece about the Athletic ran talking to data people, and they spoke to Sarah Rudd from
Mhm.
formerly of StatDNA and Arsenal, and now of Source Football, and she talked about how Arsenal they figured out center back recruiting. And I think if you look at the center backs they've recruited, it's pretty hard to
Yeah,
argue against that. But they have very clearly gotten players who can do that thing, and
yeah,
then have defended mostly in ways that they only have to do it every once in a while. Like I think if you go back to those like Arsenal City ties from a few years ago, where it was like Pep and Arteta just taking turns pressing each other, I think that was
mhm,
like the highest level of defensive football we have seen in a very long time.
yeah, man.
But I think that style of defending has its place and is useful, and I think Chelsea probably did it too much, or at
Yeah.
least did not get the appropriate benefit out of using it as much as they did.
Yeah, and again, I think this comes back to what we were talking about at the very outset, right? Which is you can only defend as well as the players that you have. And then you have to start making trade-offs, and you have to say, is it worthwhile us being like overly conservative to make sure that we're not giving up these chances? Or do we just have to get the balance right? So we're like, yes, we're going to give up more transition moments than we might want to give up, but at least we have the players who we think will be able to mitigate that as much as possible. And I think that's what it comes down to, right? And when you've got someone like Mikel Arteta, he probably goes too far the other way in terms of the conservatism. So in terms of, on the one hand, you have, I think, Arne Slot, who seems pretty happy to let his centre backs dig him out of holes. On the other hand, as you say, you've got Arsenal, who have the centre backs who probably could do that, but want to try and mitigate it as much as possible from happening in the first place. And I think that's the balance that Maresca has to find. And I think it's tough because, in many respects, he is just given a bit part squad, and like players come in all the time, players go out all the time, and there's very little consistency in that as well. So again, I think that the big question is going to be with Maresca in particular, like how can he sort of use the players that he's given to get to a point where he's finding those balances and those trade-offs to get them to the best point that they're at. And yeah, maybe that's what happened at the second half of last season. But coming back to the offside stuff, so what is it that you don't like about this? You just think they're giving up too much space, and you're sort of relying on Sanchez to sweep up a bit?
I think it's purely like a caveman brain thing, that like they concede goals that are not goals because they're offside. And in my brain, I'm like, oh, this is scary, but they're actually quite good at it. I also think there is a mental component of, when it does not work, the misses are very obvious, of the quality of chance you give up when you get the line wrong is worse than if you had dropped deeper to defend. I don't know if the data would support that it's a bad strategy call. I mean, I would say you could look at their team improvement and say, no, it was the right call. I don't know if there's an alternative strategy that would have made Chelsea 20 goals better last year. But it is, I think, a caveman brain thing of like, oh, this is scary.
But I think that caveman brain theory is there for a reason, right? Cavemen are scared of things because they're scary. You survive. There's scary things out there, right? And I think, again, like with any, this obviously isn't a high line, right? But it's an aggressive offside trap. And it's notable, I think, that many of the teams in the last decade who've used high trap or used some form of offside trap. So I'm talking Liverpool for a while, we're using a very high offside line, very aggressive offside line. Villa did it in the first few seasons under Emery. And yeah, I guess Hansi Flick is doing it now with Barcelona. Not many of those teams actually are able to use those kind of tactical ideas non-stop for multiple seasons, because they do start getting found out. Teams recognize that these are weaknesses that are there. And I think the element that you get from these sorts of traps is that teams aren't able to figure them out on the fly. But when you come around again to the following season and you start trying to use these things, Liverpool, a great example, right? Because they did it one season. Next season, Virgil van Dijk gets injured and they just stopped doing it. They were like, it's not worth us doing it without Van Dijk being there as well. So it's clearly one of those things that we're talking about, right? Where when you have elite players, some of these seemingly nuts tactics can actually be quite useful, because you have players who can carry them out to an extent that you're happy with. And a lot of this just boils down to probabilistic stuff, right? It's like, as long as we're getting the right side of this 70 times out of 100, then we're happy with this. The whole of Pep Guardiola's football is based around the premise that as long as I can get 70% win rate each season, then I'm going to win the league more often than not. And again, that boils down to this kind of concept of, can my territorial game work well enough? I'm going to make spaces that I attack smaller, force the opponent into their own box. It's going to be harder for us to break it down, and we're going to create massive spaces for the opponents to attack. But we're not worried about the qualitative aspect. We're worried about the quantitative aspect. And that is, if we have 60% possession, 70% possession around the opposition's box, we're going to generate more chances than they are, and we're probably going to outscore them. They're going to have a few chances that are going to be bigger, but you ride your luck on the fact that you've put the best players in your rest defense as possible. And I think that's what almost all football tactics boils down to at the end of the day. Is this tactic is good if we can make it work well enough for our outcomes to be guaranteed to a level that we're happy with. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see if this carries on in the next few seasons, or whether or not, in your estimation, you start seeing teams finding ways of exploiting this, and then it suddenly becomes a less valuable tactic.
Yeah, I often, and Chelsea fans will hate this. I often think about the Rafa Benitez short blanket thing
Yeah, yeah,
of just it's you cannot take away everything. Like nobody will ever be Chelsea conceding 15 goals in a season. It will never happen ever again. And
yeah.
so I think there are trade offs. The last thing I want to ask while I have you actually is I think we often get caught talking about these things as um, a static picture of like you press like this, we build like this is what happens the whole game when like things change, and
Yeah,
particularly the thing that changes is players get tired. And I think one of the things that really killed Chelsea last year, if you look at their PPDAs first half versus second half, and you have to do some game state adjusting because there's like times where they're losing and they press more because they're losing. But in where they're winning or it's an even game state, if you look first half or second half, their PPDAs drop off way a ton in the second half. They just totally run out of legs. I'm curious if there's anything that you've seen or think about teams adjusting or coaches adjusting to. We know we can only do this for so long, and we are slowly going to taper off, or we're going to use substitutions in specific situations to keep things going.
yeah. I mean, it's the Ange Postecoglou problem, right?
Yeah.
Straight up, as I see it. And that was, at the beginning of the season, they would get huge upside from just being super intense and aggressive. And then as players got injured and players got tired, their pressing became much less valuable. So I think this is weirdly, I think this is where data is starting to come into its own a bit in terms of like training plans and prep stuff for the course of a season, right? Because the reality is, and this was always my point with Ange Postecoglou, when people would say, "Yeah, but the press worked okay at the beginning of the season," it's always like, "Well, great, but you shouldn't ever be considering any football strategy and as a 90-minute thing necessarily." I mean, obviously, it does come down to that a lot of the time, but you've got to every 90-minute impinges on the other 90 minutes afterwards, right? And I think that's where data is coming in fairly clutch at the moment in the professional game. In that it's a lot of the load stuff and the training planning is much easier to do now. We know a lot more about how the game works, but also it's just a much better way of being able to mitigate a gradual reduction in intensity through the course of the season. And like I know that everyone likes to say there's too much football now, and people push back and they say, yeah, well, other teams were playing loads in the past, but the intensity of the game now is to such a high level. Teams are playing man to man in so many phases of play, and when you're doing that, like so much of it is a different kind. I think a different kind of intensity than just like sprinting to get back into position, which you do often in zonal systems, because you're having to change direction. You're having to manipulate your position on the basis of another person who reactive, and it's mentally tiring as much as it
Yeah.
is like physically tiring. So yeah, absolutely. I think that maybe we've seen a few teams in the last few seasons who are still sort of operating with this idea we can just run a universal system through the whole season, and it's gone very badly wrong. I think we'll start seeing teams adopt different approaches depending on how the season is going, and I think that's a fascinating aspect of the modern game, right? Thinking about what can we afford to get away with in this game to run with the intensity to win, but not so much that we're going to impact our future possibility of winning in another game. So yeah, I don't have anything really profound to say about it other than yes, I agree with you. That definitely happens. And yeah, also I've spoken to analysts who work at Premier League sides who are talking about this stuff. So it's definitely going to stop happening as much, or it's going to change the way that we see games. And we, yeah, but I think the reality is that I was thinking about this today. Like the old sort of approach to tactics where you're like, this is how a team plays in and out of possession, and you could just do that, right? You can't do that now because it's just
No.
meaningless. Like that, how would you describe what Chelsea, like there's certain things that you could say roughly Chelsea would be doing as a rule, right? You'd be like, okay, they tend to form this 3-2-5 shape somehow. They tend to press in these kind of ways with this kind of shape. But beyond that, it's everything is so much more detailed than it used to be, and I think it's much the better for it from a tactical point of view. And I think it's it's a shame that a lot more of the focus is on individuals. I think that people have got a bit scared of tactics because it's one, it's more complex than it's ever been. But two, I think this is very easy to fall into that mindset of, oh, tactics are actually bad because you're imposing,
Yeah.
you're impinging on the freedoms of the players, right? So now and because so many of these teams have like elite players at every position, backups in those positions as well, it's so easy to then just be like, well, the job of the coach is to get the most out of these individuals, which yes is true and has always been true, but is more true now because that's what it's like, right? The players can solve problems in a way that they couldn't in the past. Absolutely agree with that. But at the same time, the idea that then that therefore means that tactics has diminished, I just don't agree with. I think that the best coaches in the world right now are the ones who are able to give their players the sort of framework within which to really augment their talent levels. And I think there's a lot of interesting stuff to be said.
We had at ASA, we posted a thing a few years ago looking at PPDA by month, because in North America we have the weather is so ridiculous in the summer, and you can just see teams crater like 40% less pressing in the summer.
Yeah.
And I heard a story about one of the Texas-based MLS clubs were hiring a new coach, and they asked this person in the interview for a training plan for preseason and for July. And this person said, it's the same. Why would it be different? And they were like, oh, you have no idea what's coming. And I think now teams are very way smarter than they used to be, and teams are way smarter and coaches are way smarter. Like, you hear stories about Arne Slot and his time off in the summer, just like talks with analysts to be like, what did you think? What did we do poorly? What can we do better? So it's a very, very exciting time, and it's a very exciting time to follow the Premier League and other leagues through your coverage and through your guys' videos. So thank you so much for jumping on. Anything you want to plug before I let you go? Anything coming out from you guys for the previews for the season or anything?
Yeah, not really for me. I've just been off for a month writing a book, so I'm a little bit out of practice on all of what we've got going on. But yeah, I'm writing a book about football. That's about all I can say at the moment. It's not out until August 2026, so that's probably the best thing for me to plug. But yeah, discussing a lot of the sort of things we've discussed today. So if people enjoyed this, then keep an eye out. Try and remember who I am in a year's time.
Fabulous. Well, whenever the pre-order links come out, we will definitely share. And if you're listening, keep an eye out for that. John, thanks so much for coming on. And I'm sure we'll touch back in as the season goes on.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.